This is an ABC News special report.
Good morning, I'm Allison Cossack, and we're coming on the air this morning to tell you that President Trump has confirmed that strikes on Venezuela have been happening over the past few hours. And according to President Trump, that Nicolas Maduro and his wife have been captured in Venezuela. There have been scenes of multiple explosions and low-flying aircraft. All of that heard beginning around 2 a.m. local time in the capital city of Caracas. And the FAA is now banning U.S. commercial flights in Venezuela airspace over what's being called ongoing military activity. This comes after weeks of the U.S. ramping up pressure on the government of President Nicolas Maduro, including seizing 2 oil tankers and conducting deadly military strikes on alleged drug boat smugglers. This week, the Pentagon released video of 2 vessels being hit, saying they were moving along known narco trafficking routes and engaging in narco trafficking. At least 115 people have been killed in more than 30 strikes since September. The U.S. also deploying a large-scale buildup of military forces and assets in the Caribbean, sending the largest, most advanced aircraft carrier in the world, the USS Gerald Ford. It's now part of the 15,000 U.S. troops that are operating in that region. That's in addition to the joint training exercises in Trinidad and Tobago, just 7 miles away from Venezuela. The U.S. is reportedly installing a radar system on that island. In recent weeks, President Trump declaring that Venezuelan airspace should be considered closed in its entirety. Venezuela authorities denouncing that as a colonialist threat that seeks to affect the sovereignty of its airspace. The FAA warned major airlines about a potentially hazardous situation in the skies over Venezuela, citing worsening security and heightened military activity that could threaten aircraft at all altitudes. That prompted 6 international carriers to suspend flights to the capital city of Caracas. And the U.S. recently added Maduro and his government to the State Department's list of the world's most dangerous terrorist organizations. In a pre-taped interview this week, Maduro accused the U.S. of mounting a months-long pressure campaign to force a regime change and to gain access to vast oil reserves. Maduro has also denied having any ties to the drug trade, accusing the U.S. of using the drug smuggling as a way to oust him from office. Let's go to ABC News correspondent Matt Rivers. He joins us live now on the phone. Matt, what are you hearing? What's the latest?
This stunning message, quite frankly, from President Trump posting on Truth Social, where he says the United States has successfully carried out a large-scale strike against Venezuela and its president, Nicolas Maduro, who has been, along with his wife, captured and flown out of the country. He goes on to say the operation was done in conjunction with U.S. law enforcement. News conference later today at 11 a.m. That is absolutely stunning news in what is a major escalation. You know, in just the last few hours, the torrent of news that has been coming out of this situation has really just been one surprise after the next. You know, a series of very large explosions, not in some random parts of Venezuela, not on port facilities as many had suspected, but right in the heart of Caracas and the states surrounding Caracas, where we know the heart of Venezuela's military apparatus, its state security apparatus is, and where Nicolas Maduro himself has governed from for well over a decade now as the leader of Venezuela. So those explosions, people running in the streets, videos of helicopters in the air, certainly stunning images overnight in and of themselves, which led the Venezuelan government, or what is left of it apparently at this point, to put out a statement saying that it was the U.S. military responsible for this. The president of Colombia nearby had also accused the United States of doing this, but initially we didn't hear from the U.S. government specifically about what was going on until this post from President Trump on Truth Social, not only announcing that the U.S. military was responsible for these military strikes, which was surprising in and of itself, but certainly not something that was unexpected given the massive force buildup that we have seen from the U.S. military over the past several months in this region. Strikes were always a possibility given that force buildup that we've seen. But what is really going to stun the world, I think, is what happened, according to President Trump, that they were able to capture Nicolas Maduro and his wife and fly them out of the country. Remember, the United States has long accused Maduro of being a drug trafficker, of being the head of a group called the Cartel de los Soles, which is a loosely organized group in Venezuela that the United States says is responsible for pushing lots of cocaine into the Caribbean and up to the United States. There was a $50 million reward on his head at this point for information leading to his capture and arrest. And so it does appear the president is leaning into that, talking about the operation being done in conjunction with U.S. law enforcement, perhaps seeking to fend off questions down the road that might come up about the legality of strikes like this. So he's leaning into the law enforcement element of this. But there is no question this is a stunning overnight series of events in the country of Venezuela, not just these strikes themselves, but also the apparent capture and flying out of the country the head of government of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, and his wife.
With this apparently, at this point, because we are still getting information in, that this was the reason for this operation, getting Maduro and his wife, capturing them, and then flying them out of the country. Are there still operations going on, these military strikes, or do you know yet if they've subsided?
Well, from what it seems like, and again, in the initial hours after events like this, especially in the overnight hours, especially in parts of Caracas where we know the power is out, what kind of information is getting out there, there is definitely the fog of war that is in play here. And so we're very careful to only report exactly what we know. But if you look at what President Trump is saying here, the United States has successfully carried out in the past tense a large-scale strike against Venezuela and its leaders. So if you just use the president's words there, perhaps it's over, but we're not sure yet. We have to be very clear with our audience about what we know and what we don't know, and we're simply not sure. But we also know that it might not have just been Maduro himself targeted. You know, if you were going to take out the majority of the Maduro government, if you were going to reduce the capacity of the Maduro government to actually govern, then you would, of course, need to target not just Maduro himself, but also other members of his government. And so that's what we're going to be waiting to see. What else happened here? We know that there was explosions across the area in places where we know there are military bases, where we know that the state security apparatus operates from. And so what did those strikes entail? What were the intent of those strikes, and what were the outcome of those strikes? We know, obviously, according to the president, that President Maduro has been captured and taken out of the country. But I'm also curious to know what the outcome of the other strikes were, and quite frankly, who is in charge of the government of Venezuela at the moment? That is an outstanding question that we do not, at least right now, have an answer to. And remember, this is a country, millions and millions of people. The Caracas metropolitan area in and of itself, well over 3 million, 4 million, 5 million people who at the moment are learning right now at the same time as the rest of us that they no longer have a head of state. And with
Maduro out, who do you think is sort of at the realm of taking over at this point? I mean, Maduro's leadership is not recognized as legitimate by many countries, but does that mean another person from Maduro's government is stepping in, or are we seeing some other candidates step forward?
It's a good question. I mean, I don't think we have the answer to that yet. I think it's too early to tell. I mean, someone put out a statement within the Venezuelan government, and it clearly wasn't President Maduro, but we did get a message that was sent out to the media by remaining members, apparently, of the Maduro government. One man does not make a government, obviously. And so just because President Maduro is out doesn't mean that other members of his government are not still there. But what is their governing capacity? What authority does the civilian population bestow on these people? And quite frankly, what does the United States allow to happen here? I think there's no question that the United States will have a hand in who is the next person to lead Venezuela. If you look at the results of the last election in that country, which was widely considered to be a fraudulent election that Maduro lost by a 3-1 margin, there was an opposition candidate. Is that something that could happen? Could you see a democratic transition to an opposition? Sure, in theory, but you also have members of a vast security state in Venezuela, from the military on down to state-level security, on down to community-level security, that were collecting government paychecks from the Maduro government. So do they recognize a new democratic transition? These are all the kinds of questions that we simply do not have the answers to yet, given that this is just the right questions to be asking, but there's certainly no way we're going to have these answers as we continue to just sift through this information about what happened here in what has just been a stunning, just a few hours of news as this has come in, has completely upended the entire geopolitical landscape in one of the most important countries in South America.
All right, Matt Rivers, thanks so much for that great reporting and all of that analysis. Let's go to senior White House correspondent Selena Wang, who is joining us from West Palm Beach. Are you learning anything more from the White House?
Well, look, we were waiting for an official statement from a U.S. official, from the Pentagon, from the White House. But what is so stunning here is that we got the official confirmation from the president, and what he said in his post online is really stunning. I'm just going to read it to you. It says, quote, "The United States of America has successfully carried out a large-scale strike against Venezuela and its leader, President Nicolas Maduro, who has been, along with his wife, captured and flown out of the country. This operation was done in conjunction with U.S. law enforcement. Details to follow." The president goes on to say that there will be a news conference today at 11 a.m. at Mar-a-Lago here in West Palm Beach. We are still waiting for more information. We don't know where President Nicolas Maduro, along with his wife, have been taken to. There will certainly be questions asked at that 11 a.m. press conference. But look, this comes as we have seen this steady ramp up of U.S. pressure on Venezuela from an economic perspective, diplomatically, militarily, the U.S. amassing the largest military presence in the Caribbean in decades, including deploying the world's largest aircraft carrier, the USS Gerald Ford. It was known that the whole purpose of this big show of military force was directed at President Nicolas Maduro. But lawmakers from both sides unclear what the end game from the president was, but certainly this announcement from the president is striking and stunning and surprising to many. But the president has for weeks, though, been warning that land strikes were coming very soon. The president telling me not long ago that they know every house, every route, and where the drugs are manufactured, but the expectation there was that these strikes were going to be singularly focused on where these drugs are manufactured, not on leadership. Now, the president said just days ago, he revealed that the U.S. struck a dock in Venezuela that he claimed the cartels were using to transport drugs overseas. That was the beginning of this new phase of this U.S. operation, because that marks the first time we know it that the U.S. carried out a strike inside Venezuela. Prior to this, Allison, we had seen a lot of the U.S. pressure on Venezuela coming into seas. The U.S. has launched at least 30 deadly strikes against alleged drug boats in the Caribbean and the Pacific Ocean. The U.S. Coast Guard has also pursued and seized oil tankers linked to Venezuela. That is really an effort to squeeze Venezuela economically, as oil is really the lifeblood of the Maduro regime.
Okay, Selena Wang, stand by. I'm going to go back to ABC's Matt Rivers with news about a statement from Venezuela's defense minister. Matt.
Yeah, so we're just, again, this is all just coming in, so bear with us as we sift through the details here, Allison. But Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino Lopez, who is speaking from an unknown place, has apparently come out talking about this criminal, what he calls a criminal military aggression from the United States. He confirms once again that there were multiple areas within Caracas and the states surrounding Caracas that were targeted, including, crucially, Fort Tiuna. Fort Tiuna is the main military complex there right in Caracas, and striking that has certainly would certainly be considered a major escalation. And now, given what the president said, we know that that has taken place. Well, according to the defense minister, helicopters were used in combat. There was helicopter gunships used on the part of the United States. And so he is speaking and has said that the government continues. He called the United States act criminal. He's asking for people in Venezuela to remain calm and to not panic. They want to avoid chaos and anarchy. He has announced a state of emergency across the entire national territory, and he has called up a deployment of all relevant military members there inside the country. So this is the first time we're really hearing a senior member of the Maduro government come out and talk like this, a very senior person, given that is the defense minister. But crucially, it's not Maduro himself. Given what the president has said, that's not a surprise. But this is the first time that we're hearing specifically from a senior member here.
Did the defense minister mention, have any information about how many injured, how many dead?
He did say, it's a good question. He said that because these attacks happened in an urban complex, which we know is true because we know that some of the main military bases in Caracas are in populated areas, even where there are hotels nearby. He says that they are currently checking on the numbers of injured or killed, but no word yet specifically as to what those numbers are.
Okay, ABC's Matt Rivers, thanks so much for that information. I want to go to Stephen Ganyard. He's an ABC News contributor. I want to get your reaction now that we've heard, since the last time we spoke, now that we have confirmation about this move from the White House to get Maduro and his wife, capture them and out of the country. What is your reaction?
It's extraordinary. When we talked a few minutes ago, that we saw that there were videos from Caracas showing multiple helicopters, which presumably were U.S. Special Operations helicopters, MH-47 Chinooks. There appeared to be a attack by helicopters on some part of Caracas, showing rockets going into an area that appeared to be coming from helicopters. So this would seem to be a big operation that went after the main elements of the Maduro regime and the Venezuelan military. So we know that the strikes were against numerous military targets, to include communication sites up in the hills above Caracas. But most interestingly, all of that probably was a diversion, or at least something to distract the Venezuelan military while the special operations folks were in snatching Maduro and his wife.
All right, Stephen Ganyard, thanks so much for that. I want to go to Chief Global Affairs Correspondent Martha Raddatz. Martha, what is your reaction?
I think this was something that people were standing by for, but certainly not to this scale. We had 15,000 U.S. forces in the region. We have seen these strikes again and again on suspected drug boats, been asked about regime change. Certainly, Donald Trump had made threats about that, had pressured Maduro, but I don't think anyone was expecting something this large scale, and to capture the president and his wife in this sort of operation. President Trump has given hints about the CIA operations earlier this week, but nothing to this scale, and this is something we just have to watch. We certainly have the assets in the region to basically do anything we want at this point, and standing by for any reaction.
Maduro isn't recognized as a legitimate leader for many countries, from many countries. I'm curious what your thoughts are on how this is being received, this capture and takeout of Maduro and his wife, taking them out of the country. How is this being received on the world stage?
Well, on the world stage, certainly. I mean, it's shocking in many ways, whether he's seen as the legitimate leader or not. It's shocking. I'm certain some countries will be happy about this. Obviously, President Trump is happy about this after all these warnings. But on the world stage, to have the United States of America go in and grab, as President Trump has said, capture the Venezuelan president and his wife is startling around the world.
Talk to me more about the significance of that.
I think the significance of that is obvious. You have the United States involving itself in military operation that we chose to do, that President Trump chose to do without provocation beyond these drug boats, and certainly Congress will have something to say about this as well.
What are your thoughts about economically how this could impact oil prices and oil supply around the world?
Around the world, I mean, this is a major route here. We know that if there's any kind of blockade, and I know Steve Gannard has been talking about this a lot of late, if there's any kind of blockade, what happens now? Who else gets involved? I mean, that is a key thing to watch here, what the reaction is from our adversaries, certainly, from Russia, from Iran, from others who go in and out of there with oil. We've already got that tanker that the United States was pursuing, and that is something that the world will have to brace itself for as well.
All right, ABC's Martha Raddatz, thanks so much. Again, President Trump confirming this moments ago that the U.S. launched large-scale strikes against Venezuela and that President Maduro and his wife have been captured and they've been flown out of the country. We're going to go ahead and return you to your regular programming. Actually, before we do that, let's get back to Selena Wang from West Palm Beach with more information, I think, from the White House.
We're actually learning a little bit more. The president is giving a brief interview to the New York Times where he celebrated the success of the mission to capture Maduro, saying, quote, a lot of good planning and a lot of great troops and people. He went on to say it was a brilliant operation, actually. And when the president was asked if he sought congressional authority or what is next for Venezuela, the president said he would address those matters during his news conference at Mar-a-Lago this morning. The president earlier posting that news conference is going to be at 11 a.m. So, Allison, still key outstanding questions about all of this. For one, where are they taking Maduro and his wife? What will the legal charges be? Was Congress notified? Was the CIA involved in this? Who led this operation? And do U.S. forces remain on the ground? Again, this comes as we have seen repeated threats over the last several weeks and months and steady ramp up of U.S. pressure against Venezuela economically, diplomatically, militarily. The U.S. had positioned the largest military presence in the Caribbean in decades, including the world's largest aircraft carrier, this massive show of force that was really directed at President Nicolas Maduro. But so much of that pressure was really primarily focused at sea, the U.S. striking these alleged drug boats. So the president had been threatening these land strikes. Certainly a surprise to many that it has gone to this extent. The U.S. also had been pursuing seizing oil tankers linked to Venezuela. And I just want to point out one quote from the White House Chief of Staff that was given in a series of interviews to Vanity Fair that was recently published. She had suggested that this entire campaign may actually be about regime change, saying Trump, quote, wants to keep on blowing boats up until Maduro cries uncle.
With the president declaring this a successful mission, do you know, and I know you're not on the ground in Venezuela, but are there still strikes happening over Venezuela?
That is a question. I mean, if we look and dissect the president's post, he is speaking of this past tense, saying has successfully carried out a large-scale strike against Venezuela and its leader. Typically, you would not want to be posting that it's been successful if you're still in the middle of the operation. So it appears that for now, the military action has been completed. But as I just mentioned earlier, still key questions. Do U.S. forces remain on the ground? Where do things go from here? We're really in uncharted territory. And it's also unclear who led this operation. Just a few days ago, President Trump revealed himself what we know of to be the first land strikes inside Venezuela. The president saying they struck a dock in Venezuela that he claimed was used by the cartels to transport drugs overseas. It was reported by CNN that it was the CIA that carried out that strike using a drone. And then Steve Gannard has talked about why the CIA was used in that instance. It means the president doesn't need congressional authorization. Now what we're talking about here is an entirely different scale, a significant, a striking, stunning escalation.
All right, Selena Wang, thanks so much for all of that great reporting. Let's go back to ABC News contributor Stephen Gannard. Stephen, I'm curious what the ramifications you see at this moment are, knowing that, the U.S. dipped in, took Nicolas Maduro and his wife, captured them, and flew them out of the country. What are the ramifications of this?
I think this may be the end of military action, at least for now. Again, so hard to tell because, the sun hasn't come up. We don't have any reports other than Maduro is out of the country. But I do think that because they have Maduro, that the U.S. has done what they've needed to do. They've neutered the Venezuelan military, and they have Maduro. And so really there's not much reason for any follow-on U.S. military action. And so the fact that the U.S. has snatched Maduro will probably put him on trial, means that this may come to an end before it escalates. So that's an optimistic look at where we are this morning. But given that Maduro's out, the regime will essentially fall. The U.S. has hit ports, they've hit barracks, they've hit airfields, they've hit communication sites. So all of this means that the Maduro regime has essentially been brought down. And so this could be it in terms of what we're going to see out of military action by the U.S. for quite a while.
How involved do you see the U.S. in a new regime in Venezuela?
Well, hopefully the U.S. has learned some lessons about putting new regimes into place, and that will be up to the Venezuelan people. We know that there have been several candidates who've been Democrats, who've been likely legitimately elected, but the Maduro regime obviously stuffed the ballot boxes to make it look like Maduro was the elected representative. So I think what's most interesting here is what happens next, and whether those Democratic, at least those leaders who see a brighter democratic future for the people of Venezuela, whether they are able to have their voices heard, and whether they are able to overthrow the yoke of the Maduro regime.
And the overthrow of the regime, many will say that this was, obviously unexpected, but certainly, way over the top than what many would predict. Do you think this was the best way of upending the Maduro regime?
Well, it's certainly the cleanest, and it means that there'll be less military action, hopefully, going forward, and that Maduro will be brought to trial for his numerous crimes.
How do you think civilians in Venezuela are seeing this move this morning?
They're probably shocked. I mean, everybody, as Matt Rivers was reporting, he's talking to people in Caracas. The people in Caracas in Venezuela certainly had a feeling that something was going to happen given the degree and the size of the U.S. military buildup in the Caribbean, but they didn't know it would be this bold, this daring. I mean, this is going to be very interesting to figure out how the U.S. Special Operations Forces went in there. How did they snatch the Maduro and his wife? How did they get the intelligence, all of the rehearsals that would have had to have gone into effect? Where did those helicopters launch from? Really just a stunning, amazingly successful, as of right now, operation by U.S. Special Operations Forces.
Very quickly, Stephen, what do you see the U.S. Congress saying, doing about this?
Well, they're not going to be happy. I'm not seeing any reports that Congress had been notified beforehand, and part of that may be that the president wanted to maintain operational security. I mean, if you're going to put Special Operations Forces on the ground in Venezuela and in Caracas, then operational security is absolutely essential here. And so maybe the notifications weren't done. The Congress is not going to be happy about that. But if this is the last of the military strikes, then maybe that it's all going to be a moot point.
Okay, Stephen Ganyard, thanks so much for all that great analysis. Again, President Trump confirming just moments ago that the U.S. launched large-scale strikes against Venezuela and that President Maduro and his wife have been captured and flown out of Venezuela. President Trump will be holding a news conference later today, happening at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. We're going to go ahead and return you to your regular programming. Our coverage continues on ABC News Live and abcnews.com. We're going to have a full wrap-up later today on Good Morning America. I'm Allison Cossack. Have a good day.
This has been a special report from ABC News.